the church, why the church does what it does. Eventually, we're going to have to ask why it is that we sing. And that's not an easy question to answer if you've never given it much thought. Because really, it boils down to why we sing, period. Never mind why do we sing praises to God, why do we sing as a part of our worship, never mind that. Why is it humans sing in the first place? What is it about music that has drawn us to it since all of history? And that's a hard question to wrap our minds around, which is why I don't really want to get into all that. Although I suppose that might make an interesting lesson. I want us to think about why it is that we sing to the Lord. I want to assume then about singing, about music, that it touches the soul in a unique way. And I think we know this intuitively. If you are having a bad day and you're feeling down, you're feeling blue, what might you do to cope with that day? Might you turn to music? Sure, I mean, we do that on a regular basis, don't we? Music helps us to cope with some of those negative emotions that we feel. And so we might turn on a sad song, which is kind of odd. I'm sad, so I want to listen to a sad song. And someone might say, well, why do you want to listen to a sad song when you're sad? And we might say, I don't know, I just do. It helps. I don't know why, it just does. Well, I think because it touches the soul in a way that is unique. It touches the soul in a way that we can't always explain. And when we're happy, we like listening to happy music. Because it touches our soul. It helps us to cope with those happy feelings. And if you think you don't have to cope with happiness, then, well, that's human psychology. You have to cope with everything in life. And yeah, you have to cope with happiness. It's much more comfortable coping with happiness than it is coping with sadness, but there you go. It helps us to maintain that happiness, to sort through it. It helps us to put it in its proper place. It helps us to express it. By the way, when we're sad, sometimes we like to listen to happy music because it touches our soul in a unique way, a way like nothing else can. And sometimes when we're happy, we like listening to sad music. Not to make us sad, but to make us reflective, right? Because it touches our soul in such a unique way that nothing else does. So we're going to assume that about singing, and then we're going to ask the question, we're going to take all of that, and we're going to ask the question, why then is music involved in our worship to God? As an aside, if you think that the Church of Christ does not use music in their worship to God, have you been here? Isn't what we were just doing music? Would you call that music? You opened up the songbook and you see on the page a bunch of words and some music? Isn't that what singing is? Words put to music? Music definitely is a part of our worship to God. Now, we would say, we would teach that the Bible does not, or God does not want us to use mechanical music in our worship to God, but that's a different discussion altogether. So let's get this thing right. We're not saying we don't use music. We do. We use the music of our voice. Why? Well, let's open up to Psalm 95. We're going to look at it and Psalm 96. In these two Psalms, I think we get several answers to our question. Because the New Testament, really the Old Testament too, assumes that we will sing. It assumes that we will sing. And when you read in the New Testament about Christians singing, or about here's when, like James 5, verse 13 is, if anyone is married, let him sing, or in Colossians 3 or in Ephesians 5, when you read those types of commands, those types of passages that talk about our singing, privately or corporately, when we're together, you will find this assumption when you sing, this is what you do. There's not a passage in the New Testament about singing that correlates quite like, that correlates to the Lord's Supper. Here's the Lord's Supper. Here's what it is. Here's the emblems. Here's what they mean. Here's what this is. And here, it's not done with singing. It assumes that we will. So why? There's where I want to go back to the Old Testament. I want to understand why God's people have always sung to Him. Let's read. Psalm 95. Oh, come, let us sing to the Lord. Let us shout joyfully to the rock of our salvation. Let us come before His presence with thanksgiving. Let us shout joyfully to Him with psalms. For the Lord is the great God and the great King above all gods. In His hand are the deep places of the earth. The heights of the hills are His also. The sea is His, for He made it, and His hands formed the dry land. O come, let us worship and bow down. Let us kneel before the Lord our Maker, for He is our God, and we are the people of His pasture and the sheep of His hand. Today, if you will hear His voice, do not harden your hearts as in the rebellion, as in the day of trial in the wilderness, when your fathers tested me, when they tried me, though they saw my work. For 40 years I was grieved with that generation and said, it is a people who go astray in their hearts, and they do not know my ways. So I swore in my wrath, they shall not enter my rest. Now, I don't know about you, but that sounds like two different psalms. Down about verse 8, end of verse 7 or so, your Bible may format it like mine, where verse 7 has an extra line in it, where the last line of verse 7 is with verse 8. And you can see a break there, and I can understand why they put a break there, can't you? Suddenly we go from, let us sing to the Lord, let us shout to the rock of our salvation, and we speak about how great God is, and how good God is, and how powerful God is, and how creative God is. And then we go to this exhortation. Today, if you will hear His voice, if you will hear His voice, here's what God is going to say. Don't harden your hearts as in the day of rebellion, as in the day of trial in the wilderness, etc., etc. And now we start speaking in the first person, as if God is speaking to us. When your fathers tested me, they tried me, for though they saw my work. For 40 years I was grieved with them. And so we change perspective. The psalm begins by the congregation shouting up to God in praise for His greatness and His salvation and His deliverance and His creative work and His power. And then the perspective shifts to God, who then says, you need to listen to me, not like your fathers did, about whom I swore in my wrath they won't enter in my rest. What do we make of that? Well, let's kind of digest it here. Let's understand what's going on, because what we have in this psalm are reasons why we ought to praise the name of God. And you can see pretty clearly in the first 7 verses why we ought to praise God. Because He is the great God and the King above all gods. If that isn't the first, and this may sound redundant, the first and primary reason, the first and most important reason to sing the praises of God, I don't know what else I would put there. Because He is the great King and God of all the gods. Does this psalm indicate that there are other gods among whom God simply is the best? Psalm 96 says something similar, by the way, in verse 4. The Lord is great and greatly to be praised. He is to be feared above all gods, for all the gods of the peoples are idols, but the Lord made the heavens. That's led some people to look and say, well, there you go. The Old Testament teaches that there are many gods, but just this one particular God is better than them all. I would say to that all of the gods of the nations around Israel, though they did not exist, were real enough to the nations. They firmly believed that those gods existed and were real and had a real effect in the world. And so the psalm says, you think your God is real, but my God actually made everything. It's interesting here, and I said earlier at the nursing home, we kind of talked about these psalms for a little bit, and I made the point that the psalms were written in Hebrew, so it doesn't work in Hebrew. But I do like that there's a little bit of an English play on words there in Psalm 96, verse 5, that the gods of all the peoples are idols, I-D-O-L, they're idol, but they're also idle, I-D-L-E, because it's God who made the heavens, it's God who made the earth, it's God who made the seas, and all of those other gods, they sat idly by, if they even are real in the first place, they sat idly by while God actually did something. And now, in the world, they sit idly by, and the world happens while God is the one who holds the world in His hands. He is the King and the God above all the other gods, in that He actually is divine. And they are merely idols, the work of men's hands. So we sing praises to God because He is the only one to whom we could possibly sing praises on this level. We also sing praises to God because He made everything. For His creative power. And you'll note there's two parts to that. It's His power, that's true, but also His creative power. And so, yes, He is powerful, He is able, He is capable of accomplishing whatever He needs to accomplish, but He also used that power to accomplish something. It is not merely that God is omnipotent that we should praise Him, but that He used that omnipotence to accomplish something, and I might add, to accomplish something for our benefit. If a man had the kind of power that we might say is omnipotence, he had the ability to accomplish whatever he wanted to accomplish, how might that man wield that power? Can you imagine? It's a little bit of a thought experiment, is it? Because we have a saying that power corrupts, and absolute power corrupts absolutely. And if a man had the absolute power to do whatever he wanted to do and to accomplish whatever he wanted to accomplish, he might begin by accomplishing great things. Can we imagine a man saying, I have this power, I'm going to do something good? Yes, I think we can. Can I also imagine that it probably would not take very long before he also would be saying, but you know what, I've done all this for everybody else, I think I can do something for me too. And that then to become the theme of what he does. And you know, when I do stuff for me, inevitably I'm going to do something for me at the expense of someone else. Because that's the way that works, right? Not everything that I can have can be had without harming somebody else. And so if I give myself whatever I want, eventually somebody's going to get it. And then where do we go from there? That's where we get the absolute power corrupts absolutely. If a man had that kind of power, it would not take him very long before he simply would just not, or would simply use it only for himself and for his ends. And yet God used His power to benefit us. He worked on our behalf. We call that love. God demonstrated His love for us in that while we were still sinners, Christ died for us. Romans 5, verse 8. God so loved the world that He gave His only begotten Son. John 3:16. God made everything that there is, and He made it such that it would provide for us, because this world provides for us, and such that it would be enjoyable. And I suppose He didn't have to do either one of those things. He made this world for us. And so we sing His praises. He made not just this world, but He made us. And that is a reason to sing the praises of God, because He made us. Let us worship and bow down. Let us kneel before the Lord our Maker, for He is our God. We are the people of His pasture and the sheep of His hand. We belong to Him. He made us. And so we sing His praises. And by the way, we do so whether we want to or not. By our very existence, we point to the existence and the glory and the power of God. David even would write psalms about how I am fearfully and wonderfully made, and how marvelous are your works, and that my soul knows right well. I know that intimately because David says, I have given that so much thought, I cannot fathom how wonderfully I'm made, and so then how great is the Maker who made me. But even the fact that I exist, if I refuse to acknowledge God, the fact that I exist points to the God who made me. How wonderful is it then when I, who by my very existence points to God, whether I want to or not, choose to sing His praises. Which is exactly what David did in that, Psalm 137, something like that. It's exactly what David did in that psalm, and it's exactly what he is doing here when he says, let us worship and bow down. Because when we sing, it is not only an acknowledgement of the glory of God, it is also an acknowledgement of my place before Him. Who I am in His presence. I recognize that He alone is the great King and great God above all the gods, that He has all of this creative power that He has used for my benefit because He loves me, and that I am His creation. And I am so small before Him. It reminds us of where we are before God. We are His creation. And as such, I have a duty to God. When we sing our praises to God, we acknowledge that we have a duty to God. That's the last half of this psalm. Today, if you will hear His voice, this is what you should hear. That's, by the way, it's what we call an ellipsis. So there's this statement, but it leaves off the rest. It's kind of implied in it. Today, if you'll hear His voice, here's what you will hear. And that's verse 8 on. Do not harden your hearts. Don't harden your hearts. Soften your hearts. Let us sing. Let us shout. Let us come before Him. Let us shout joyfully. Let us worship. Let us bow down. Let us kneel. That's a soft heart. Don't harden your heart. Don't harden your hearts as in the day of rebellion, as in the day of trial in the wilderness. And we can think back in our Hebrew history to the time when the Israelites were wandering through the wilderness, how often they encountered this day. It's not one particular day that the psalmist has in mind. It's a bunch of days that happened. The day on which came some kind of rebellion, some kind of trial. And when the children of Israel encountered a trial in the wilderness, very often what they did was they hardened their hearts. Even to the point of saying, would that we would have stayed in Egypt because at least we had cucumbers. I kid you not, that's what they said. Can you imagine trading your soul, your life, your freedom for cucumbers? For leeks? And yet they did. Or at least they wanted to. And yet God was patient with them. Boy, and that's what kills me, is that God was patient with them. Verse 9, you can hear that, by the way, when he says, your fathers tested me, they tried me, though they saw my work. They tested me, they tried me. God is a patient God, because you are not tested if you fail the first test. You can't say, oh, I was tested. I mean, I failed that one, but they tested me, and the first time they did, boy, I stamped them out. That's not what we say, is it? We don't say they tested me, they tried me, if on that first time that they did, God just wiped them out. No, instead, He put up with them. That's the sense. They tested me, they tried me, even though they saw my work. I still showed them my work, and I was patient with them. For 40 years I was grieved with that generation. We might get too hung up on the fact that he was grieved, and we forget that it was 40 years that he grieved with that generation. How patient of a God is our God. And I said, it's a people who go astray in their hearts. They do not know my ways. And the intent there is, they will not know my ways. They do not. They refuse to know my ways. After all this time, they still don't know my ways. And so I swore in my wrath, they shall not enter my rest. You know why we sing the praises of God? It's because we have a duty to Him, because He's been kind and patient and loving and all the things that we've talked about in bringing us out of sin and leading us to where He needs us to be, where He wants us to be, in the place in which we will be blessed, and we still don't get it. When we sing our praises to God, it is an acknowledgement, I sometimes don't get it, and I know. You still have to be patient with me, and I wish that you didn't have to. When we sing our praises to God, it is an acknowledgement of this duty that we have to obey God in everything. Because there will come a day when God will judge the world by that righteous one whom He has appointed. Acts 17. There will come a day when God will say of some, they will not enter my rest. It's for this reason, by the way, if I can make this aside, that Hebrews chapter 4 urges us over and over and over again, you hold on to your hope so that you may enter that rest. There does remain a rest for the people of God, so you hold on so that you are not shut out. You say, shut out, that sounds pretty harsh. Well, those are the words that Jesus chose in that image in Matthew 25 when He talked about the 10 virgins. And He said that there came a point at which the 5 foolish virgins were out buying more oil for their lamps, and the doors were shut. And they would not be opened for them. There is an acknowledgement when we sing that we have a responsibility to God to obey Him in everything. Now listen to Psalm 96, 7 through 9. Give to the Lord, O families of the peoples. Give to the Lord glory and strength. Give to the Lord the glory due His name. Bring an offering and come into His courts. O worship the Lord in the beauty of holiness. Tremble before Him, all the earth. Say among the nations, we'll keep reading, the Lord reigns, the world also is firmly established, it shall not be moved. He shall judge the peoples righteously. Let the heavens rejoice and the earth be glad. Let the sea roar and all its fullness. Let the field be joyful and all that is in it. Then all the trees of the woods will rejoice before the Lord, for He is coming For he is coming to judge the earth. He shall judge the world with righteousness and the peoples with his truth. We sing praises to God because we acknowledge our duty before him to obey him, to follow him, to soften our hearts before him because of his goodness. What Ephesians 5:19 and Colossians 3:16 say. This is Ephesians 5:19. Speaking to one another in psalms and hymns and spiritual songs, singing and making melody in your hearts to the Lord. Did you catch that on the end? To the Lord. Singing, making melody in your heart to the Lord. What does music do? It touches us in a way that nothing else does. It touches our soul. It cuts to the heart like nothing else does. And we sing and we make melody in our heart to the Lord. Now look at Colossians. Colossians 3, this is verse 16. Let the word of Christ dwell in you richly in all wisdom, teaching and admonishing one another in psalms and hymns and spiritual songs, singing with grace in your hearts to the Lord. Singing with grace in your heart to the Lord. Here, we might speak in this place, here, we might speak of God's grace to us. How appropriate, how wonderful, how often do we speak of our grace to God? I am singing with grace in my heart to the Lord. This is my gift to God. An offering. Hebrews chapter 2. Offering of our lips. And so we sing with grace in our hearts to the Lord, because music touches us in a way that nothing else does. It cuts to the heart. But notice, teaching and admonishing. Do Ephesians 5:19 and Colossians 3:16 fit with the reasons given to sing praise to God in Psalm 95 and Psalm 96? That there is something in my heart that I want to give to God because of who he is, yes. And that there is an acknowledgement of a duty that I have, that you have, that we have, and that we share to God. Yes, what is that duty? Psalm 95? Don't harden your hearts. Don't be as their fathers were. And instead, enter into his rest. Teaching, admonishing. You want to know the background of Colossians 3, of Ephesians chapter 5? There it is, right there. And that's why we sing. Because God is God. And he has used his creative power for our benefit. And he made us. And he made us into who he needed us to be, wanted us to be, and has been patient with us and kind to us and loving toward us. He has done everything that he can for us and is calling us home to be with him. And if you would heed that song, then we'll sing this song to encourage you. Let's stand.